My name's Dave, and I had bad breakups before and been through different kinds of relations, but this was one would top my whole experience. I know this sounds boring at first, but it will get a lot more interesting, I promise. I met Kim at this one friend's get-together party thing. We got along really, really well. My dark, stupid humor matched hers, and that whole night we stuck together and exchanged phone numbers at the end of it all. It didn't take long for us to text one another, and from that, I knew I was destined to be with this amazing girl who matched my energy. Stupid, corny jokes, same taste in music, food. It was something that was just meant to be. We dated for 8 months, and going into the 9th, it started to get a little rocky. We agreed on most things, but for some stupid reason we started butting heads. Every day it just felt like we were drifting apart, and by the 10th, we finally broke it off. I was in pieces from it, and I could tell she was also. I ignored her calls for maybe a few weeks, and I just wanted to move on. I was mature enough to just try and get myself together. Eventually, the calls stopped, and I sheltered myself under my apartment and focused on work. It was a tough one for me, and thankfully I started to let go of Kim. One night, I was at home making myself dinner, and I just so happened to glance out the window, and there was Kim across the street, standing with her hand over another. I looked and turned away, no matter how hard it was not to. This started to be a frequent occurrence around the same time every night, and honestly, I wanted to run out there and just hug and hold her tightly, tell her how much I miss her and wanted to give us another chance. But this was what was best for both of us. One night, when I returned home from the bar, I looked at the time and was hopping to catch Kim on one of her stakeouts. I was a bit drunk and wanted to just pour my heart out. I waited and waited even as it rained. I still waited, but at that point, it started to get close to midnight. I decided to walk to her apartment, which was just a 15-minute distance from my place, which I didn't mind walking. During the walk, I planned out what I would say, rehearsed word for word, and was beginning to feel a joy of just seeing her again, holding her and smelling that strawberry smell in her hair. When I arrived at apartment, I could see that her light was on, and I was in luck. I felt so alive and just felt right to be back with her, cause she was everything I've always wanted, and I knew she felt the same way as me. I stood too at her door, a complete nervous wreck, fixing up my collar, still tipsy from my trip at the bar, slicked my wet rained-on hair, and I knocked. The loud heart pulse in my ear was louder than my nervous breathing. I knocked once more, and that's when her roommate Cassidy opened the door slowly. I asked Kai, "Yeah, is Kim around?" Cassidy closed the door and unlocked the chain and opened it once more. "Hasn't anyone told you?" "Oh my God, I'm sorry, Dave, but someone should have told you. Kim was in an accident a few weeks ago. She was hit by a car when riding her bike home from work. She died right then and there. I'm so sorry. Her eyes filled with tears as I stood in the hallway, shaken up, broken all over again. I had no words or actions I could do to shake this grief of shock, and that's when it hit me. She started showing up outside my apartment right around the time she had the accident. At that moment, my grief turned to I don't know what. How to explain it? I always thought the expression blood turning cold was just a thing, but that's what really happened. It's been almost a year since this happened, and once in a while, I catch a glance outside my window, and at times it feels like she's still there looking up at my window, but I can't bear to look down, cause What if she's still out there looking up at me, as much as I miss her and loved Kim, I just can't look out the window around that certain time of night. I grew up with my sister living in a large house, along with my mother and father. It was a big house, but was such fun to run around in with just me and my sister. We did everything together. We'd watch TV or just sit around with coloring books, build stuff with blocks, and sometimes even have her read stories to me. She would always be the last to leave my room at night, and the first to be by my beside. When I would wake up, we were inseparable every day. I couldn't imagine life without her at that time. Even when I would go to school, she would be the first person I'd run to just to talk about my day. And all the activities I did, she would always listen to my every word. She kept me out of trouble, and sometimes would be the trouble to pull little pranks on our parents. One day, I woke up and I was kind of stunned to find she wasn't there to say good morning, Bug, like how she would always do. But that morning was different. I went to my parents asking where Katie was, and all they would say was, "I don't know, sweetie," which I found really odd. I started to feel scared for whatever reason, cause she wasn't there. I acted out in crying fits, asking for Katie. Where Katie? I want Katie. When nighttime came around, she wasn't there to put me to sleep, and of course I acted out again and again. This went on for weeks, until it was time my parents would take me to a child psychologist. I kept asking about Katie, no matter who I talked to, cause she was my world and my everything. She was my safety. But it turns out, Katie didn't exist at all. But I knew she was real, no matter how much they tried to convince me she wasn't. I thought back to all the times me and Katie played, watched TV, colored in my books, and even read stories at night in my bed. All those times I asked my parents about Katie. That whole time they thought I was just making up an imaginary friend and played along with it whenever I would mention or acknowledge her, but they were just doing so to keep my imagination sharp. They had started to suspect I was developing a type of schizophrenia, hence why the child psychologist was an option. For years I seen the psychologist and told him about Katie and how she looked, talked, her age and all the basics, but over time I somehow grown to accept that she was just make-believe like they said she was. Then I got older. I eventually grew out of the phase and forgot about Katie altogether, up until I became an adult. One afternoon, I was sorting through old junk in my parents' house when I came across an old drawing of me and Katie that I had made. We were holding hands and reading a book as looked, and all these memories came flooding back. I remembered Katie and I felt a sense of comfort overwhelm me as I sat down looking at that drawing in the garage, and that's when I started to realize something. I took out my phone and looked up some old town records along with the address of the house I grew up in. It turns out that 10 years before we had moved into this house was another house that burned down. A mother and her 2 kids made it out safely, but one child didn't. 9-year-old Katie died in the fire, trapped in her own room. I remember always wondering why Katie's face was pale and red on one side of her face, hair stringy and wet, but never questioned out loud cause. I was a naive and thought that's just how she was cause. She was always around me for as long as I can remember. I wasn't schizophrenic, wasn't delusional or crazy, none of those things they said I was. She wasn't even an imaginary friend of mine that I just made up. Katie was a ghost who I thought was my sister that whole time. There are days when I go to visit my mother since my dad passed. I'll be alone walking down those long hallways and I'll feel a little hand holding mine. I'd stop and close my eyes and whisper, "Hello, sister," and we'd walk into a room and just like that, she'd be gone. I like to think she's watching over my mother when I'm not around. It brings a comfort to know that Katie still cares and is still there. My dad had bought a house straight up for cash, just out on a whim. He had surprised me and my 2 other siblings, so it was a step up from the slums for sure. He came across some money, which he won't explain, and I shouldn't care how so, but that's not the point. All he told us was that the house was for cheap and got a good deal for it. The only catch was that it needed some repair work. As my dad was carpenter, he could fix it up no problem at all, It was his thing. I, being the older child of the three, I had a help in it, and I wasn't too bad at it myself. It took a few months to complete the work since I was still in school, so it became a weekend project for the two of us, while the young ones played and did their own thing. My brother Tim was always the goofy one and always laughing, playing practical jokes, and was the laugh of the family. Always wanted to be a comedian, as he says. But he started to change after the first month we moved in and did the work. His jokes became less and less and less, and he grew mean to our youngest sister. He began to swear and have random outbursts, fits of rage that would land him in trouble with our father. Of course, he would be disciplined and had his toys taken away, which would just make things worse. We had no clue as to why he was acting this way. His health started to drop, and even so, we asked why he was being like this. There were a few times he would seem like he wanted to speak up and tells us, but he would just stop mid-sentence, throw a fit. One night, as our father was out working late, I was with the kids and Tim started to act up. I called my father cause this anger was becoming destructive like never before. It didn't take long for our father to get home, and when he did, he found Tim sitting on his bed, which was pushed away from the wall, and seen he had been attacking one certain spot on the wall. Scratches and dents along with red markings from his crayons drawn in circles could be seen. My father managed to calm him down as he cried uncontrollably in his arms. I stood against the doorframe watching the whole thing, and something told me that he was trying to tell us something. That weekend, I suggested that the young'uns be sent to our aunts for the night, and Dad agreed. He seemed all right at my aunt's or so, she says. He was his normal self, and was happy to hear that. When I knew me and Dad were alone, I went down to the shed and grabbed a sledgehammer as he watched what I was about to do. He looked at me like I was crazy as I took the first swing. "What the hell are you doing, boy?" I looked at him and kept swinging till there was a 2-foot hole in the wall. I pulled out another foot of drywall off and grabbed a flashlight. Dad stood over my shoulder as I shined the light into the darkness, and we both instantly stepped back in fear. My dad pulled me back, and he grabs a hug piece of the wall and ripped it back, along with some pieces of wood, and that's where it was. A mummified hand falls out with 3 fingers curled, and the index finger pointed out. We pulled the rest of the wall back to find the rest of the body and found it had been a female. Dad immediately called the cops, and they came with a forensic team to investigate everything, which took a few days. Turns out that the woman had been murdered in Tim's room, and her remains were sealed. What really disturbed me was that the fact her hand, her pointing finger, was right where Tim's head would be when he slept. When we asked him about what was going on with him, he didn't hesitate to tell us the woman in my wall talks to me. She kept tapping on the wall when I tried to sleep, but she wouldn't stop. She won't stop until I helped her, but I couldn't tell anyone. She choked me. We never knew anything, even as he tried to tell us that was the cause of his outbursts and acting differently. As we grew up, Tim just kind of forgotten the whole thing, and we never mentioned it. We moved out of the house soon after that, and everything went back to normal. Me and Dad brought it up sometimes, but that's it. We never knew how that woman was killed or who did it. We were just glad time is oak and is oak, and we're out of that house. It was a midsummer night, and it was a hot night in Arizona. I worked as a coroner and seen many things that just never bothered me as much. Dead people were just bodies to me, so the job came easy. The sight of some of the things I've seen were just natural, no matter how gruesome they were. The one case that really bothered me was a old woman named Anne, as we came to know her from identification found in the house. No one had seen or heard from her in almost a few days, which was unusual due to her neighbors. So the police did a wellness check on her and found her dead laying on her side. Looks like it was a stroke, but couldn't be entirely sure. My coworker and I were sent to pick up the remains. When we arrived to the small house that should have been condemned due to its poor condition, we walked inside the front door, and there she was. I thought it was going to be a pick-up and grab usually kind of thing, but I was so wrong. The position she died in was something out of a horror movie. She was laying on her side, but her back was contorted in such a way that seemed almost unreal. Her neck and head were further back with a look on her face which chilled me to the bone, a look of excruciating pain or horror. Her arms, stretched out as if she was reaching for something. Fingers looked like claws, bony arms with barely any muscle. I'm not sure what happened with me, but I immediately froze in fear at the sight of her. When it was time to put her in a bag, we just couldn't cause of the shape she was in. I couldn't stop looking at her face. Sunken in cheekbones and eyes caved in. No teeth at all, and it was just scary to me. We were unable to zip her up and couldn't just snap her back into place since the rigor mortis had long set in. We had no choice but to white shear her and put her on a stretcher, take her as is and into the back of the truck. Unfortunately, I was the lucky one to ride in the back with Anne. I had to keep her from falling off since the awkward position. As the truck started driving, I did my best to strap her down, but it required hands-on stability. I held onto her bony arms like I was holding onto a cold tree branch as the white sheet started to fall off. I kept trying to keep it in place, but due to my partner's bad driving, the sheet had slipped off, and that's when I had enough. Her face became visible and was staring me right in the face, her gray sunken-in eyes staring at me with that painful horror expression, looking me in the eyes. Holding her as still as possible, even as I started to shake at my grip on her. My breathing got heavier by the second, each time I would look at her and try to look away. My mind began playing trick on me. It was as if she was exhaling in my face and the smell of death was heavy, mere inches from Anne's horrific face. I quietly began to cry just as I was experiencing my first ever panic attack. I couldn't bear to stand it any longer, even as I screamed at my partner to hurry up. My fear of this woman had set in, dizzy and close to fainting while glancing at her at my peripheral vision. 10 minutes later, we arrived at our destination, and I immediately car'd to the back door of the truck, opened it, and fell to the cold pavement catching my breath while shaking uncontrollably. Everyone who was there known me to be one of the strongest-willed people, but that right there was my breaking point. I cried as I caught my breath. One of the men there had to comfort me and take me away, but just as we were walking inside, I took one last look at Anne's body, and it just so happened to lean sideways off the stretcher and fall to the floor of the truck, which prompted her neck and arms to snap at impact. I quickly dropped my head as the other workers there rushed to cover her up and take her body off from the truck. I quit my job a week later due to high anxiety from the experience, and now I work at a warehouse, still medicated and taking it easy these days. The look of Anne's face still haunts me and always will. I shudder at the thought and sight of anybody these days, so funerals is what I try to avoid.